Welcome to this meeting on the quality of impact assessment and environmental justice. We should two things to say. First off, well, actually three things, is congratulations on getting up to greet the day and coming to the conference nice and early after the fantastic party last night. The second thing to say is thank you very much to the eThekwini municipality for sponsoring this session. And the third thing is that we are being streamed on Facebook Live. Both or one? It's on YouTube. So welcome to everybody who's watching, and thank you very much indeed for tuning in. But also, if you don't want to be on YouTube, then now's your time to go. The question about quality and impact assessment is something we looked at we considered at both the EIA conference in 2015 and in 2016. And informed by these sessions and subsequent discussions, we published an article on quality in impact assessment. And this was in the Environmental Impact Assessment Review, and it's called A Contribution to the Conceptualization of Quality in Impact Assessment. And we felt it important to begin to identify what these notions of quality are. We all have a sense of what is good in impact assessment, and we are all working towards something that is good, but we rarely take the time to step back and define what that good is. And good is an abstract value, and it's shared. People come at many different stakeholders are involved in impact assessment, and everybody comes with a subtly differing conceptualization of good or of quality. So we wanted to open a discussion on this. And I should also just note the other authors for this. So my co-chair for this session, Alan Bond, was the lead author. There was Frans Trouwer-Betief, Monica Fundingsland, Peter Duinker, Rob Vahim, and Lex Brown from Australia. We identified 8 dimensions of quality, and these are efficiency, optimacy, conformance, legitimacy, equity, capacity maintenance, the transformative capacity of impact assessment, and the management of and quality management as teams running impact assessment are put into place. So in relation to the conference theme, we see there is a clear link between equity and justice. And justice is also implicit in many of the other dimensions as well. And we have heard throughout the conference of the importance of impact assessment for environmental justice. And again, notions of quality run through that. So we now invite each of the speakers to present on the topics. Each speaker has been allocated 12 minutes. And after each presentation, we'll take just one question for clarification purposes, if needed. We will give speakers a 2-minute warning, and we're going to be very strict. And urge them to keep the time so that we can have the opportunity for at least 15 minutes of discussion afterwards before we sum up. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce and invite Morgan Hauptfleisch to come to the podium. And Morgan, if you'd like to introduce yourself and get going.
Thank you very much, Ben, for the introduction. As Ben said, we have been kept very strictly to our time here, but as Ben might not know, and to quote a friend of mine, that God gave the European a watch and he gave the African time. So good luck with keeping me to my time. So just to put everybody in the picture, unfortunately, if you were looking at the program for today, this is not going to look at all EIA in sub-Saharan Africa. It really is some research and some preliminary findings that we have from research that we are conducting using the process of external reviews of EIAs and seeing if we can find some trends which fit into the theme and into those broader areas of quality which Ben mentioned a little earlier. So quality considers the ability of an impact assessment really to achieve its intended outcomes. That's been unpacked in the paper which Ben mentioned. And what is that EIA? So it's a technical tool used in planning, as well as a legal instrument. And I think that has come into impact assessment, obviously, with time and as countries have caught up to minimize the negative impacts of a development and enhance the positive impacts. So it's useful just to go back to that broader defining definition of an EIA. And quality in itself, as Ben mentioned, is quite difficult to define. But if we look at how quality of environmental impact assessment reports were reviewed in the process that I was involved in, it really looks at the impact assessment process and the impact assessment report itself. So each legally mandated impact assessment is judged on its quality at some level, either by a country environmental authority, which it always does do to allow that environmental license to operate, by development proponents as well. They review EIA reports to make sure they're getting a quality product out of it and that it is compliant. By lenders, there are many of the donors in the room as well, the World Bank and development banks, by interested and affected parties often, so they would have them reviewed externally if it's a controversial EIA, if they perceive that certain processes of the EIA are being circumvented, by courts sometimes, because we all know of court cases involved with environmental impact assessments, and then sometimes by external reviewers on behalf of each one of the above. And it's really on those external reviewers' reports that we have relied to pick out some trends in impact assessments in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's very much selected. It's not random countries. You'll see it's quite clustered, the ones that we've taken, but it still provides some interesting insights for the process. So the study that we conducted took 56 external reviews of quality or effectiveness in 8 sub-Saharan African countries, conducted by SAIA. Many of you are familiar with the people of SAIA. There are some SAIA representatives sitting in the room right here, who developed an external review system over time. Now, what's important about this is it doesn't really look at the effectiveness of the impact assessment results. So what happens after the EIA process? It's looking very much at the EIA itself. So it's not looking down the line, which I think is something that's really interesting, and I think there's some really good research that needs to be conducted on really the effectiveness of the EIAs afterwards. And we will go down that line. But what these external reviews are doing is taking the classic areas of impact assessment, and they've unpacked it into 198 areas, looking at the environmental impact assessment reports. It wasn't just developed by SAIA, it was collaboratively done also with many stakeholders and regulators, practitioners, donor groups, lenders that have been working with SAIA over the years. SAIA being one of the oldest EIA custodians in Southern Africa, really looking at the EIA process. So we thought it was really nice to look at their external reviews as a basis of how well we are doing. As you can see, not randomly situated, it really looks at countries and areas where EIA reviews were requested by either one of the groups that I spoke about earlier. And there is some other interesting research being conducted at why external environmental impact assessment reviews were requested by these specific areas and these specific countries. I think, I'm involved in wildlife science, so I think the home range of SAIA can be quite clearly defined in this as well, being situated, in Windhoek. So quite a lot of them done at home, and why not do reviews in Namibia, right? And also fewer, but also spread out quite nicely in terms of where they are. If I look at some of the quality that we found, now if we look at the axes of this graph, along the y-axis it goes from really poor, so a really excellent review, would be a 5 out of 5, and it goes down to a really poor review as being a 1. So if we split this up per sector, we're finding some interesting things. We're finding a very broad variance in terms of quality in the agriculture sector, energy sector as well, but those reviews really being between the okay, the acceptable, the compliant, let's say, impact assessment, right up to being comprehensive or complete or excellent. If we look at other sectors, we can see mining being right around the okay or compliant one, right? So they're around compliant, going a little bit better, a little bit worse, but really looking at that compliance as being the outcome of the EIA. Energy sector, interestingly enough, have had some really innovative EIAs in terms of the reviews. So they've been aiming a little bit higher in terms of the reviews that we've been looking at. So it's just interesting, you can see that. Obviously in some of the others we had very few, housing and transportation, but it gives you an idea where we are situated in terms of the efforts going into the environmental impact assessments. If we look at it per country, no surprises, Namibia having the best EIAs. I'm not being biased. But we can also see a large variance in a number of the countries. The ones that were conducted in South Africa, around also getting towards compliance, but really having compliance as the intended outcome. Now the really interesting part, and that's what's happened to these over time, because they're over quite a large portion of time. So there's our trend of EIA quality over time, taking into account these 56 EIAs. Quite interesting that we've had a drop in overall quality, but towards the end also a much higher variance. Some really excellent EIAs, but some really poor ones coming through. And if you break that down into the parts of the environmental impact assessment, the classic parts that we always look at, we can see that across all areas that's the case. It's not that we've been getting better at looking at the defining of impacts or at how we convey the information to the layman through a non-technical summary. But it's actually in all areas that we found a decrease in the quality of the impact assessments. Now, why is that? Well, there are a couple of reasons, and I've teased this through with some of the grey beards or grey heads in the room to see why this might be. And number one, the volume of EIAs have increased. The pressure on the practitioners to provide a product has increased. In most of Southern Africa, EIAs can still be done by anybody. Certification is largely something which is voluntary, and that seems to be contributing that more people are doing it. You're getting more environmental entrepreneurs getting involved in the business, and you're getting a wider variety of these happening. EIAs are being required to be done faster and cheaper. And that leads me to a little bit of a question which I'll tease out, and that's, is compliance the new excellence within the IA community? And looking forward to next year's conference on revolution or evolution in IA, I think this is a question we might want to pose each other as well. But then there's another one. Has the reviewer's expectation increased? And some of the reviewers are sitting in the room, and I've spoken to them as well. And we are, as a core, we are expecting improvement as a core principle of impact assessment. Continual improvement is very much part of our process. Are we getting that? Thanks, Ellen. Or are we just getting compliance? If I look about these 56 EIAs and some trends that we have, what are we doing better and what are we not doing so well in? Well, if you look at the complete or comprehensive or excellent part of an EIA report and the adequate part, that sort of area, we're okay with the method. We know how to do EIAs. We're okay with describing the environment. There's enough data on it that we can describe our receiving environment well enough. Our general approach, involvement of stakeholders, is improving. And that's we're generally okay in. What are we rubbish at? Why don't we do that well? The old one, the old Achilles heel, the one that our clients often don't want to look at much, assessment of alternatives. Describing the impacts in a way that it's understandable to the broader community is something that we're doing less well in. And we're struggling to convey this in a punchy way for the decision makers in a non-technical summary. But I've got 1 minute to go. What are we actually doing? Well, we're actually saying, if you look at what's dominating on this graph, it's the adequate. So we're okay at all these things, which in my terms means that we're pretty mediocre at them. That's compliance, right? That's what we're doing. And just in conclusion then, just a couple of formulas to bring in your minds. Before impact assessment, we had this. So we had nature, there was development, we said take the development away, we want nature. We changed that to having nature plus development with an EIA, which led us to sustainable development. And in this community, we had sustainable development, meaning excellence, meaning justice. Is that still the case? Are we there? I hope so, but I can't confirm that. Thank you very much.
So we were going to see if there was anybody had a clarification question before we move on. So we'll do this for all the speakers. Just if anybody has clarification, otherwise we'll move on because we're going to keep the discussion for the end. Okay. So just a point of clarification, please.
Why the energy sector is doing a little bit better. Why is that so? Is it because of funding from international financiers? Thank you.
I think we'll have the general discussion later on, but I can just very briefly say that we're exploring that. But I think the mere fact that the energy sector has to be compliant in terms of the requirements of international donors helps, but also it's quite tricky. If you look at hydropower, for example, in the areas where they are, and the rivers that they're doing, it's requiring some innovation, which I think is coming through in the reviews.
Thank you. Okay, so if I can invite Karen to come up for the next presentation. Oh, well done.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Karen. I'm from Environmental Protection Department of the Hong Kong SAR government. Today, I'm very delighted to be here to share with you all the environmental justice through effective EIA system in Hong Kong. This work has been done with me and my colleague Clara over there. How many of you have been in Hong Kong? Whoa, unexpected. Okay, I can save some time to introduce Hong Kong there. Hong Kong is a small city at the southern China. It's about 1,100 square kilometers, but we have more than 7.4 million of people. So you can imagine how densely populated it is. We are very famous in having all these high-rise buildings, but we have a wide variety of natural habitats. We have hilly terrains, mudflats, sandy beaches, and we have very rich biodiversity. So what can we do in order to have an effective environmental governance? Well, our governments recognize or acknowledge the importance of public participation and public engagement. In terms of those policy plans and programs and projects, we provide a wide variety of channels to the citizens in Hong Kong to provide their views, opinions, and exchange of ideas, including websites. Every year we have the budget and policy address, so we have all these kind of online channels to the citizens in Hong Kong to tell us what do they want, basically. We have this roving exhibition. We have colleagues standing there to answer citizens' questions as well, not just putting information of the plans and the projects, but we do answer people's questions as well. We have organized school talks, site visits to legislative councillors and district councillors. We organize question and answer sessions to the local communities when we have to explain all those plans, policies, and projects, etc. One of the examples that I would like to show you here is our first city's biodiversity strategy and action plan, which is BSAP, which incorporate all these kind of channels in explaining to the citizens on what the governments wanted to do and whether they can, contribute to the BSAP plans as well. I think some of you have already attended the talks given by my colleagues on the EIA process in Hong Kong, so I'm not going to go through every single details, provided that I've only got 12 minutes. But I would like to highlight that we have 2 stages of public engagement exercise in our EIA process, in which after the project proponent submits a project profile for a study brief, and we do listen to the public's comment, including the Advisory Council on the Environment, which is the advisory body to the governments in relation to environmental matters. We also listen to the public prior to the approval of a EIA report. Our EIA process is an objective mechanism, which is not only just with our jurisdiction in terms of air quality, noise impact, etc. We also take advice from other government departments. For example, in terms of ecology, we also take advice from agricultural, fishery, and conservation departments in Hong Kong as well. I would like to highlight this continuous public involvement, which terms as CPI. Our government encourage the project proponent to engage the public as early as possible, well before the formulation of the project ideas, throughout the EIA process, during the construction of a project, and even after the operation or during the operation of a project as well, which in terms of CPI, it can reflect or indicate the environmental justice. When we talk about environmental justice, we have 3 key components: whether the public can access to the information, whether the public can access to justice in terms of environmental matters, and whether the public can participate in the decision-making process. So I would like to show you an example here, which is the expansion of the Hong Kong International Airport into a 3-runway system, 3RS. It is a mega project. It involves reclamation of 650 hectares of waters on the western side of Hong Kong. But it's not just an expansion of the runway. We're talking about a huge socio-economic impact, talking about expansion of the terminals. We have all this new baggage handling system as well. Well before the project idea is being formulated, the project proponents, Airport Authority Hong Kong, has already conducted a series of engagement exercises to talk to the local communities, talk to the citizens in Hong Kong, even engage the politicians and legislative councillors, etc., to see whether there is a need to expand the runway and how that would benefit to Hong Kong as a whole. And up till now, the project is in the construction stage. The project proponent has already conducted more than 1,000 engagement exercises, and they even engaged more than 22,000 school kids. You might ask, why school kids? Why secondary and tertiary students? Well, because they're the next generation in our society. So it's very important to get the youth generation to be engaged and know what's going to happen. I think like a city in Hong Kong is so dynamic, and there is a wide variety of very diverse opinions. Provided that our EIA system is so robust and effective, we still face legal challenges because it is hardly reached 100% consent in terms of all those different views. Here is a table to show you how a summary of the judicial review in the last 2 decades since the enactment of our Environmental Impact Assessment Ordinance. Because of the time limit, I'm not going to go for every single details here. But I would like to show you, highlight 2 key things here. These are the 5 JR cases out from over 250 EIA reports that put into the court for testified. If you look at the duration of the JR case, it's normally take at least almost 2 years for the case to be completely resolved. So it means what? Lots of time and resources, money has been involved. Another thing that I would like to highlight is the major areas being challenged. If you look at all those 5 JR cases or of the EIA reports, the ecology one is the most challenging, followed by the air quality and the noise impacts as well. However, I would like to highlight some key points here. Throughout all the judgment of the JR court, you can see that the judges, they all agree one thing, in which it is a professional judgment of what information should be included or contained in an EIA report. It's very important that the court also acknowledge that our EIA system is very robust and effective. And moreover, in terms of the mitigation measures effectiveness, we are all talking about the three order: avoidance, minimization, and compensation. And it is acknowledged by the courts that we have already followed all these three orders of priority when we look at the EIA reports as well. So what can we do if we are still facing all these kind of conflicts? Well, I would like to show you 4 potential solutions that might be able to help. First of all, our departments have already asked the project proponents to set up the dedicated project website for each of the EIA projects. For example, this is the 3RS. As you can see, they got a dedicated website. All the information related to the EIA report, the submission under the environmental permit, and even the liaison groups meeting materials, meeting notes, and other activities, etc. They're all on the website, so that the citizens in Hong Kong or everyone can access it. Another one is the maritime surveillance system. They make use of technology so that people can use a mobile phone or a desktop to look at, to monitor whether the construction vessels are, speeding or, going to somewhere else. Another thing is accreditation of the impact assessment professionals. I think some of you have already, listened lots of talks on the importance of the accreditation of IA professionals. And in Hong Kong, we are paving the way to having the accreditation of IA professionals as well. It's very important to acknowledge the importance of IA quality. Last but not least is the independent environmental monitoring and audit mechanism. We have a very transparent EM&A mechanisms in which people can access on the internet on every single data during the construction and even the operation stage of a project. In conclusion, I know I'm keeping the time very well. The EIA in Hong Kong is used as a tool in planning, design, and control. And our system is being tested in the court and is really professional, fair, and transparent to the public. Last but not least, we recognize the importance to empower the community and stakeholders in order to reflect the environmental justice in our EIA system. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions and discussion later on. Thank you very much.
And that's great, Karen. Thank you. Just if there's any points of clarification, otherwise we'll move swiftly on. No? Okay. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
I have to be difficult and not do it in PowerPoint. Okay. Thank you, everyone. This is going to be the fastest 12 minutes of my life, isn't it? I want to pick up on an aspect of what Morgan was talking about earlier with recognition that it really doesn't fit well with what Bruce was saying about really understanding importance. I want to talk about just one aspect of looking at an impact assessment and its quality, and that is the effect characterization. And what we did is a review of 57 impact assessments from 12 different countries, really just as a scan of practice to try to identify how is effect characterization taking place and what approaches were being used, particularly for the social disciplines within an EIA. So just so we're on the same page of what we're talking about here, when I say effect characterization, here's an overall schematic of the different steps that we would go through in an impact assessment, starting with scoping, moving through baseline data gathering, assessing impact, and that little iterative state of looking at mitigations. When all that is done and you've mitigated as best you can, you're left with some sort of residual impact. And very often this is characterized to try to describe in some way the importance of what that residual impact is. For any of the different effects that we're looking at, this is often done by looking at a number of different parameters, such as magnitude, geographic extent, likelihood, duration, etc. And this is done because all the different types of effects that are looked at in an impact assessment are very, very varied. How do you compare these things one to another? How do you understand the importance? You're not talking about comparing apples to apples or apples to even oranges. You're talking about comparing apples to microwave ovens. They can be hugely different. So trying to put some sort of standardization, at least in terms of how you describe things, not assigning importance or significance, but how do you describe what's going on, can be quite important to do. Within an impact assessment, it often comes out looking like this. You have a number of different effects that you're looking at. In this case, you have population increase, change in settlement patterns, change in social cohesion, etc. The columns represent the different parameters that you could look at: duration, intensity or severity, spatial extent, likelihood. I didn't do this one. This is just a screen capture from generic EIAs here. And then within each of those parameters, levels are assigned. Something could be high or moderate or low. It could be certain or uncertain or improbable. It could be positive or negative. So this is the terminology that I'm talking about. This is what I mean by effect characterization. These things like duration or magnitude are parameters, and then what I'm calling levels would be the high, the medium, or the low. One of the reasons to do this is that effect characterization is considered to be good practice. I'm not going to say best practice, because there are some practitioners who will go to their deaths fighting for the right not to do this, because they feel really it's about the narrative itself, and that's where the value lies. I completely agree that a good, rich narrative is the best way to describe something, but when you're trying to sum up and say, okay, so we've talked about 100 different things, which are the ones that are really most important to look at first, that effect characterization can be a really good way to transparently lay out this information. But at the same time, we also know that particularly when you're looking at the social effects, which I will also include health effects in, within an integrated impact assessment, there's often a really poor fit between the parameters that are chosen, which often fit better or are chosen because they work well for the biophysical sciences, and they often really do not work very well as a way to describe what's going on socially or in the health realm. So this brings us to our study. We really had 3 questions. It's not a question of what should happen, but just what is happening now. It's a scan of current practice. We wanted to know, firstly, what % of SIAs, or the social sections of EIAs, characterize social impacts? What % do this at all? Secondly, what parameters are most common? And third, what % of those provide definitions for different levels? Because some they just say high or low without telling you what does that really mean. So a quick note about the methods, just so you understand what we were doing. We wanted some sort of clear terms that we were working under to say, how are we going to find these impact assessments to look at? We didn't just want to use Google, because we felt that if we did it that way, or just asked practitioners for their favorite impact assessments, we were likely to come up with the ones that are larger or more well-known or more well-publicized, and thus are likely to be more well done as opposed to more clearly representative of what was out there. So we decided to turn to national databases, to looking at countries that had a national register of all the impact assessments that had happened recently, and you can click on and gather that information. We wanted to be somewhat geographically representative, so we decided we would choose 12 countries, 2 from each of the major continents that produce EIAs, so none from Antarctica. We wanted any sort of an impact assessment that included socioeconomic topics, and then we would take it, and the country had to be able to put forward at least 3 for us to look at, and then we would take a maximum of 5. So the first 5 that we could get, but if it could contribute at least 3, it was in. So this is our first mini finding. We were able to pull down impact assessments from these 12 countries: Uganda, Kenya, Hong Kong, Philippines, Portugal, Spain, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Belize, and Chile. So those were the 12 countries that we worked with, each of which contributed at least 3, and most often 5. The thing that I find really interesting is here's 59 countries that we absolutely could not get a national register for, or that did not meet the criteria in some sort of other way. We know these countries have, many of them have lots and lots of EIAs going on. France, for example, the United Kingdom, they simply weren't organized in a way or presented in any sort of a way that we could get at them systematically. So that's why they don't show up in this 12 countries. So the fact that we were able to get 12 and not 59 in our top list is something that I personally find quite interesting. Now for the results. Question 1, what percent of SIAs characterize social impacts? And I should mention that we went looking for either SIAs or the social component of EIAs. We only found the latter. We only found the social component of EIAs, and none of the national sites registered just social impact assessments. Well, 61% did, and 39% did not. Our 61% is liberal, in the sense that if they did it at all, however poorly, however inconsistently, we counted it as a yes. So 61% of these EIAs said that yes, they did characterize impacts in some way. Here's that same pie chart turned into a bar so that we could line up the countries. And what you see is that there's some countries that do it consistently, one certainly that did it inconsistently, and somewhere in between. We didn't go into the reasons for this. It could be practitioner preference, it could be the regulatory environment, it could just be happenstance for what we pulled down. We also wanted to look at this in terms of the sector, and what you see here, the little numbers behind tourism, mining, et cetera, indicate how many impact assessments came from that particular sector. And we thought perhaps there was some sort of bias that certain industries would do it more consistently than not. This to me is not a very strong finding, but it was at least interesting. So there seems to be some difference, but I'm not convinced that it's systematic in any way. Question 2, what parameters were most commonly used? Interestingly to me, it's the same ones that you would find in the biophysical section of the report: duration, magnitude, direction, geographic extent, likelihood, reversibility, etc. These are the ones that mostly tended to come up, ranging from about 8% to slightly more than 60% of the social components that had to use these. Here's a number of other ones that were used by 1 or 2 reports. They can be very varied. Sometimes they got social context or stakeholder importance or social value, but this didn't happen very frequently. These are the ones that tended to be more tailor-made for the social side, but they're not in wide use. And again, I think this comes back to the fact that the social components are shoehorned very often under the biophysical and made to take the shape of what fits for the biophysical side. Question 3, what percent of these actually defined levels? And this is important because is my high the same as your high? Is my low the same as your low? The only way that we're going to know is if you actually lay out a definition. So we were looking for something that looked like this, that would say, this is what negligible means, this is what medium means, this is what we wanted to see. So of that 61% that even characterized effect, only slightly more than half defined what they meant by those different levels. Almost half did not even do it at all. And if I have a practice takeaway from this presentation, it's that it's really, really important to define what you mean. What do you mean by high? Because even if we then disagree on what that means, we're at least working from some sort of a template. To show you the variety of what this comes up with, here's the definition of low magnitude from 4 different impact assessments that we pulled. The first one, changes cannot be distinguished from base case, makes a reference to what existed before. The second one, utilization, so utilization of services or of infrastructure capacity is this quantitative number between 75 and 90%. Those are very different concepts. The third one, it falls below a guideline or threshold value. Again, a very different concept that you're working with. And the fourth one, the natural processes of functions are not affected in any significant way. So these are very, very different ways of conceptualizing what is meant by magnitude. So this is just to illustrate the great range that you can come across. I think I'm going to skip this one for likelihood, but this will all be in the paper that we have. Again, the one that I wanted to point out is this very tautological one at the bottom, where high means it's highly likely, medium means that it's medium likely, and low means that it's unlikely. Well, thank you very much. Conclusions and implications for environmental justice, with my probably minute and a half left here, is that in my opinion, and those of some writers that I've been reading, if we're to achieve environmental justice in decision making, you need to have accountability, transparency, participation, and inclusion. To me, effect characterization speaks to this transparency piece. It's about giving people the understanding of why you're making the decisions that you're making, or the regulator is making the decisions that it is making. And if we don't put that information forward about how we've come to these conclusions, rather than just saying, oh, it's professional judgment, we're sure we're right here, we're not going to achieve that sort of justice. And there's a good quote here saying, making good data transparent puts environmental justice into action, which is a quote that I really like. And with my 1 minute or slightly less left, I'm just going to say that this is not yet published. It was turned down by Alan Bond's stinking journal. But the IAPA, maybe we have a shot. The whole origin of this is that we actually wanted to get to a set of our own definitions and to put those forward as a sort of a straw dog for how could we start as practitioners to come to a common understanding. So I brought some copies here in case you're interested of the definitions that we've created for 9 or 10 different parameters. They're absolutely not perfect. They have to be tailored to the specific context in the project, but we're hoping that by putting these forward, that we can come to some sort of a shared understanding or at least a starting point to help us improve our quality. That's it. I'll leave them up here on the table.
Okay, and I'll run around with the mic. Is there a question of clarification to Marla? No, we can move on. Thank you very much, Clara.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kamijo from Japan, and my organization is Japan International Cooperation Agency. Today, I explain about the quality of EI report our organization prepared. So now my work is research, but before I was EIA engineer. So at that moment, I have long time. I have a question how to improve the EIA report qualities under the present constraints. Yeah, I read many papers, but many papers say more data or more capacity or more budget, but it is very, very difficult at the present situation. So today I explain about I focus interaction effect between alternatives and public involvement affecting the overall quality of EI report. I explain my data analysis. So three purposes. First, to clarify the alternatives and public involvement determinants of EI report quality. And second, to clarify the interaction effect between the two processes affecting the overall report qualities. And then last, to propose the guidance for satisfactory EI reports. So introduction, first one is my previous research. Alternatives and public involvement could be key factor for report qualities, I clarified. So second, but however, little is known about the interaction effect between alternatives and public involvement affecting the overall report quality. So I little bit explain about interaction effect. Interaction effect, two or more independent variables work together to affect the dependent variable. So many information available. So in my case, number two, the overall report quality, I want to explain the overall report quality would be influenced by the interaction effect between alternatives and public involvement. So data, 160 EI reports prepared by our organization, 10 per year for the years between 2001 and 2016, 16 years. And the quality review based on the quality review package, I use a very famous package. And second, statistical test to see the introduction effect. We have now guidelines, environmental assessment guidelines 2010 at the present, but before 2010, we have 2004. So before 2004, we have no mandatory guidelines on very, very voluntary basis. Third, I use a cluster analysis and decision tree analysis to show alternatives and public involvement as determinants of the overall report qualities. And fourth, regression analysis, very simple regression analysis to test interaction effect between alternatives analysis and public involvement. So now I think already everyone knows this famous review package. So I use this symbol A, B, C, D, E, F So A, B, C is satisfactory and D, E, F not satisfactory. So I review the quality of the EI report following this review package. So now, next I show some my result. This is a report quality and 3 periods. I divided the 3 periods. First period, before 2004, is no guideline, no mandatory guidelines, just a voluntary basis. And from second period, 2005 to 2010, it is a guideline after introduction of guideline 2004. And third period, 2011 to 2016, is after the new guideline 2010. So I show the number of the reports. Category A, 0. Category B, total 21. Category C, grade C is 40. Grade D, 80. Grade E, 19. Grade F, 0. So this is a AC, this satisfactory report. The rate is increasing. So probably guideline is effect. So the next is I use a statistical test, very simple one, cross-color Wallis test, and p-value is less than 0.05. Therefore, I recognize report quality is significantly improved by introduction of JIGA guidelines in 2004 and 2010. So probably guidelines improve the quality of our reports. So next, I want to know the reason why improve. So I prepare some data like this for cluster analysis and decision tree analysis. First, level EI level or IE level. EI level is a very detailed full-scale assessment for large-scale projects, and IE means a very simple assessment for small projects. So previous study also say the quality of the report of EI level is significantly good compared to the IE level. So I use these factors. So level is a very probably key factors. So next, alternative and public involvement also key factors according to my previous studies. Next, number of alternatives, number of criteria. Those also probably key factors because I observed good quality. In case of the good qualities, usually many alternatives, many criteria analyzed. So third one is number of public involvement. 2 means scoping stage and drafting stage, public involvement. So 2 stages. 1 stage is only drafting report stage. And 0 means no public involvement, like this. And another area 1, area 2, area 3, area 4, overall qualities, this is followed by review package. So I prepare those data for cluster analysis and decision tree analysis. And qualitative variables like EIA or IE, yes or no, were converted to dummy variables. I use dummy variables. And ordinary scale from A to F converted to rank scores like 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. This is the result of the cluster analysis. So 4 clusters, we are available 4 clusters. And 2 clusters is a good quality report, and another 2 clusters is no good reports, divided to a good report and not good reports. So if we know there are some branching conditions, for example, this and this, probably those conditions are determinants for good quality reports. So I use decision tree analysis. This is the result of the decision tree analysis for the so 4 clusters. I explain this tree analysis. For example, first condition is alternative. Alternative yes, this part. And second condition is public involvement no, but in case of yes, good quality public involvement yes, so this way. So for good quality reports, alternatives and public involvement are determinants. Yeah, so those two are determinants. So next, I want to analyze, examine the interaction effect. This is the interaction effect result of analysis. So I prepare scatter diagram too. Y is overall quality, report quality, and X alternatives, grade of alternatives. And another one, Y is overall same, and X public environment stage. So I prepare scatter diagrams, and I show some regression line. It means PI 0, it means no involvement. So effect is very low, and PI 2 improved, and PI 2 also improved. So I suppose this table shows the public involvement increase the effect of the alternatives, and this also public involvement. This alternative 0, alternative 1 is very low grade. No alternatives, like only public involvement, very low. But this one, alternative 4, is grade C of alternatives. Interaction effect, we show the interaction effect. So this red line shows a large interaction effect. So next, so these two figures show the interaction effect because those inclinations are different. It means the interaction effect. So, but I prepare the calculated regression analysis also. This is the result of regression analysis. And X1 is grade Y is overall quality. X1 is alternatives. X2 is public involvement stage. X1 times X2, it means interaction effect. So square R is 0.54 and P is very small. So, and next, this is the interaction effect. So regression coefficient interaction, P is very small. So I suppose I recognize interaction effect is significant. So this figure and this regression analysis show the interaction effect. So next, I interpret interaction effect. What is the role of the public involvement? So my interpretation is this one. Public involvement would moderate the effect of alternatives to the overall report qualities. This is my interpretation. So my analysis means only public involvement, very low effect. But with alternatives like this, effect is good. And this table shows some guidance for satisfactory EI report. This part, for example, alternative 5, this alternative grade C. Grade C alternative and two-stage public involvement are marked here. Grade 4 of overall quality, it means C. Therefore, I suppose this is the one benchmark, alternative 4 and public involvement 2, scoping stage and drafting report stage is the one threshold for satisfactory reports. So now, conclusion. So alternative analysis and public involvement are the determinants of JICA EI reports. And second, the public involvement would moderate the effect of alternatives to the report quality. And third, the grade C, just satisfactory of alternatives and 2 times public involvement could be the guidance for satisfactory EI reports. Yeah, last page about environmental justice. The public involvement promotes environmental justice and improves the EI quality. And in my case, in my study, justifies the effect of public involvement to improve the quality of EI reports based on data analysis. Yeah, thank you very much.
So just quickly, any questions of clarification? So these are just clarification, then we'll move on to the bigger discussion. So the first hand I saw was over here, Clara. So we'll just have one question of clarification.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm coming from Vietnam. Could you please explain a little bit more? You choose only EIA report from Zyka system because it maybe all of the report go through one system, maybe a little bit biased. Why do you choose some report from another system? Thank you.
Thank you. JICA EIA system is very popular one, not so specific, very standard one. So process also very standard, and divide and public movement. So not very standard. Probably Vietnam system is more advanced to ours. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is move on to the broad discussion. If anybody has specific questions of any of the speakers, then of course you can ask them. So I would like to ask each of the presenters to move up to the front table. Ben is going to act as Mr. Roving microphone. And I'll hand the microphone to the people. Yeah, there's one on the table. Don't panic. So now we've had 5 fascinating discussions. Hands are flying up already. Feel free to ask any questions related to the theme of the day or any specific questions to each of the presenters. So we have 2 hands at the back.
Thank you very much, Barry Dalal Clayton. This question was prompted by Morgan's presentation, but it could equally apply to all the others, or some of them at least. Did you take into account terms of reference when assessing the quality of the EIAs? Because work that I've done on reviewing SEAs shows that the single most important determinant of quality is terms of reference. If the terms of reference are poor, no matter how good or dedicated the practitioner might be, or skilled, if he's or she is restricted by the terms of reference, i.e. the time that may be available, where they can go, the amount of budget that's available, all kinds of factors, that constrains what can be done. And I think that's a very important factor. I've not looked at it in EIA, but I would be interested to know if any of you considered that factor.
Can I answer that,
Yeah,
Alan? Barry, thank you very much for the question, and you've given a bit of an answer to your question too, which I agree with. In terms of my reviews, yes, but very weakly it was considered because it's just a question of were there terms of reference and are they included in the report? So I do think that digging deeper and looking at the quality of those terms of reference would be great. And maybe doing some kind of a correlation experiment as the final speaker did with the terms of reference quality might give us some quite interesting results. But I totally agree with you.
So anybody else want to comment?
Well, just one quick thing to add. In terms of the work that we've done, the terms of reference often do not have the details that are necessary to guide the practitioners. And all too often, there's a lot of discretion practitioners have, and it's largely the result of the terms of reference being quite open, in particular with respect to assessing impacts and characterizing those effects to indigenous values.
Good morning, I'm Sean O'Byrne. Morgan, also a question for you, and I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to quote you exactly because your presentation was a long time ago and it was a very good party last night. But you said something along the lines of, we understand the method well, but isn't it that we understand the process well, but our methods are poor in terms of determination of EIA quality? So we have a regulatory process which we follow, and that gives us kind of completeness. But the comprehensiveness of the assessment, surely what we lack is method.
Thank you, Sean. And if you're a week after the party, it's just your fault being the organizer. But I do understand where you're coming from, and that's a useful comment that I can take on board. The definition of method, I think, comes into it then. I think there's probably a difference between method and how to do an EIA report. So the process that, as you say, it's more the process that we can do than the method.
Mine won't be like a question. I think I just wanted to contribute to something that was raised. In our country, the regulator looks at the TORs even before the EIA is done. Would you probably have considered that and said, well, we leave out the TORs? Thank you.
Was that a question for myself again, sir?
No, it's just a contribution for all of you. I just wanted to know whether you probably left it out, because like our country, the terms of reference are first approved even before the EIA is done. So I would take it that you wouldn't want to really deal with the terms of reference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I think just very briefly, in my case, we can look exactly where that happened along the process, as I'm looking at 15 years worth of EIA reviews. And it hasn't always been the case like that. So it could be an interesting analysis to look at where in the process approval of the terms of reference before the EIA came in and how that affected quality. But as you would have seen, the overall quality has dropped in my case. So.
Okay, so there's another question. Nick?
Yeah, thanks guys for a great set of presentations. So a general question to you, Nick King, South Africa, is to say the quality of the reports is one thing, the outcomes from those reports is another thing. And for those of you who know Pete Ashton, I'll quote a Pete Ashtonism, if I may, which is that environmental assessment is all about who's doing what to whom, how often, and are they happy? Okay, so the question to you is, are the stakeholders happy with the outcomes? And the quality of the report may determine that, or it may not. It reflects a little bit on Sean's point about the process, are we getting it right? So are the stakeholders happy with the outcomes of the reports which you were evaluating? And maybe it wasn't part of what you were evaluating, but that might be the determinant of just how good environmental assessment is.
Well, it would be good to get a couple of perspectives on that. I think we should give Morgan a rest. And I'd also love to hear what Bruce's view on that is as well. And then maybe someone else.
I can do it. Well, your question would be like whether all the stakeholders are happy with the EIA outcomes, and the answer would be no, because not all of them would be happy about the environmental outcomes. As I mentioned in the presentation, that it's really difficult to reach 100% consent. But throughout all those years, in the last 2 decades since the enactment of our EIA ordinance in Hong Kong, we can see that the environmental outcomes have been improved, and the quality of the EIA reports or the whole industry is being improved throughout the continuous public involvement. And we do listen to the public and engage the public, and all their comments are being reflected when we issue the study brief or when we approve the EIA report. And more importantly, the project proponents, they learn as well through all those years. And they, for example, all those, the example that I showed, the maritime surveillance system, that is exactly the outcome that's being catered for the public's concern, because they, some members of the public, they are concerned about whether there might be exceedance or incompliance of the construction vessels, and that's why the project proponent listen to them and they invent the technology to do that.
I think a very quick answer to your question would be no. The outcomes are not liked, and I guess that would apply to both hydroelectric development, oil and gas development, and mining development. The communities I work for are not anti-development, they are anti-bad development, and environmental assessments seem to be the means in which colonialism is still occurring. It's the way that they're still pushed off the land, or their values are just diminished. Whether it be a hydroelectric development that's taking out 15,000 years of history, things that do not exist anywhere else in their valley. They only have 20% of the river left because there's another 2 dams. whether it be a wind farm that's placed beside a sacred site that is so old nobody can even date it with the rocks, or it's a pipeline for shale gas development that goes through a caribou critical area when there's only 26 animals left, down from a couple thousand. So EAs as a whole have failed. Regulators who overlook terms of reference are either not qualified or sometimes don't think they have the political backing to improve situations. It's very difficult sometimes to point to what works, but every now and again something does work. But it's largely the result of our proponent taking ownership of the situation, both in terms of their project, but also the history, which they didn't cause, but what they understand influences the present. And there's 2 cases out of 50 that has occurred. One was because there was someone local, and another was because of some of the individuals in the company actually had experience in Africa, and then told us about their experiences over here and how they changed the way they tried to do things even in Canada. So they brought some values from Africa over to Canada, and they were actually astonished that Canadian practices were as poor as they were.
Thank you. Next question.
Arend Hugevorst, Eagle Environmental, South Africa. My question is aimed at Bruce. Bruce, I think the comments you made in your paper were probably some of the most significant comments I have heard in this conference to date. The issue of culture is critical to sound impact assessments, and it's significant that a lot of people that carry out the impact assessments do not relate to the culture of the situations they may well be assessing. Now, obviously, what you've done in your work has identified a lot of these issues. Do you think, as a result of your work, you could produce guidelines for other impact assessors in the rest of the world to sensitize themselves more effectively on cultural issues and recognize that we are not the people that we are affecting or we are assessing, and unless we understand where they're coming from, our assessments are basically flawed. So my question is, do you think you could produce a guideline on what you've actually come up with, which could be used elsewhere in the world?
In terms of producing guidance, yes, some of the work we've done, some of the other studies that I've been working on with the community, we hope to publish some of the work that will provide at least some insights for people to look at things. Some of the recent work we've almost completed on weighted impact techniques, I think did a very good job incorporating and actually addressing some of the scientific issues through actually using traditional knowledge. In terms of providing guidance for others, and especially other areas, that's where I think it's the people I work with would be concerned about. That's almost a form of, I'm not sure what word to use, imposing their views or their ways, their policies, their thinking on other Indigenous people. When you're in a territory of someone else, the first thing you should be doing is working with them, not bringing in preconceived ideas. That's what happens right now. So a lot of the work and the teachings that I've been lucky to experience would suggest that there are better ways to do it. There are practitioners can get better, but it's like a yes and a no to your answer. I apologize, I can't give you, yes, I hope all of us do it as a collective in a lot of different countries. Some of the work the weighted impact assessments, we learned from some of the research that a professor did with the Maori, or he's Maori himself, but some of the work that they did, I was able to take that back to the community. We talked about the cultural understandings and how they improved impact scoring. And then we were able to take a couple more steps after that. So I think it's learning from one another rather than the guidelines that say this is how you do it with someone else. It's understanding and learning from one another that eventually it gets better, I hope. Anyways.
Thank you. So the next question.
I'm Jay Alunge from Nigeria. I have concerning the last presenter. You came out with two determinants in terms of project alternatives and also public involvement. Knowing fully well that AI process is a life cycle issue, the procedural aspect, then what happens when you determine the quality of EIA report? What happens with effectiveness of EIA itself? Because you single out only project alternatives and public involvement. What are other determinants that one can see? You are not only looking at it from the regulator point of view or a consultant point of view, but also the client outside there wants to know, and then the mother heart also wants to benefit from it. What is your own view, other determinant of quality of EIA?
Thank you for questions. My analysis, for example, some data EIA reports, I analyze is 160 reports, cover many sectors and many regions around the world. So, many opinions say EIA report, so many variations, so factor is very, very difficult to identify. So I just say alternatives and public rent and the number of the public rent stage. That is very, very simple. So someone criticized. Another factor probably available. But my studies, I want to say, of course, site different, sector different, people different, so many difference. But I suppose some common, even variation is very large, but some common factors probably exist. So I want to show some common factors. So my alternative is just I use a Lee review package, so just a C, grade C, very, very simple. Probably in your country also you can analyze alternative grade C level. And I say just 2 stages, just I say a number of 2. It is also someone very criticized me, only just not only numbers say, but I suppose probably this number is one of the common factors. So of course, there are so many variations and many other determinants also, each individual EI reports, but my analysis, I want to focus common factors. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's loads of interest. We'll get through as many questions as we can, but I am anxious to finish on time. But Jos wants to be on telly. Go, Jos.
Thank you. Jos Aerts, University of Groningen, the Netherlands. I just want to go back to the title because a bit puzzled that the relation between quality and justice. So what is, to your opinion, are they just similar? What are the differences? Not only to the panel, but perhaps to us all who has a good answer, and especially also you, Alan and Ben, you raised this question. I think it's a very important question, but I would like to hear some crisp insights in this, the difference or the similarities between quality and justice. Thank you.
Well, that's Ben asked me to sum up at the end, which is the world's greatest stitch-up in history, so I'll try and get there.
Maybe we have 3 more questions. It might be worth that we bundle the questions, take the 3 remaining questions and let the panel a chance to answer those. Yeah, so Josh.
Thank you, Josh Fothergill from the UK. Public participation, engagement, clearly very, very key. So I guess how far do you feel, or is objective assessment as an impact assessment kind of professional mindset, is that itself a cultural barrier?
And I have a question, particularly with Karen in mind. You mentioned independent monitoring, and my question is, could you expand on that? It is because of the insight and brilliance that comes from the independent monitoring, or just the sense of justice that somebody outside is doing it, whether it's done well or not?
Okay, and the final question, which we have time for, unfortunately, but here we go.
Thank you very much. I'm Vincent Duplessis from the Gauteng Department of Agriculture and Rural Development here in South Africa. And recently the Minister has published the regulation to appoint a regulation authority for impact assessment professionals in South Africa. Now, for me, reviewing EIAs on a daily basis, just to relate also to inputs and outputs, are people happy with the outputs? We cannot craft proper outputs if we do not have the proper inputs. So the quality of the reports are key. So I wanted to find out from the panel as well as the audience, the success of sort of a registration authority or body where professionals would register with. Does it really make a big difference? Is this a good move on South Africa's side?
Okay, so that's all our questions. There was a specific one to you, was there not, Karen? So if you want to deal with that.
Hello. Thanks, Glenn, for the questions. For the independent monitoring, we have the EM&A mechanism. And under these mechanisms, we have the environmental team and independent environmental checker as well. So that these two teams, I would say, in this way, and that they have to audit and to monitor the progress of the project. And then they send us the audit report, and then we have a team, which Clara is also in a compliance session now, and then to look at all those data and reports, and then we have the surprise check as well. So that's what I mean by independence. And of course, because all the data are transparent and available to the public, and some concern groups, they also check the data by themselves as well, so which helps the government on monitoring the project as well.
Thank you. And so would somebody like to take the lead on answering either of the other two questions? Go on, Marlo.
I'm going to go back to Jos's question because I found it really interesting, and it was something that I puzzled over for quite a while. How does quality and environmental justice relate? Particularly as I had to talk to it at the end of this talk. I couldn't figure it out. So I'm really curious to hear what Ben has to say. I mean, there are things that seem to be necessary but not sufficient components of environmental justice. Transparency was one of them, and fairness and accountability. But I still haven't been able to quite puzzle out how does the one relate to another, or are they just on parallel tracks? So I'm really curious to hear from the audience too, if anybody has a brilliant solution. I'd love to hear it.
I guess the example I would use to help us understand that is the one chief I work with, he posed something to the government. He said, how about you go away and get your science right, and then we'll talk about our things. And what he was getting at there is the technical aspect of EA is so poor that it's very difficult to understand where and how to not only include traditional knowledge, but how to start talking about Indigenous rights. And it's not that Indigenous rights comes afterwards, it's throughout, but how do we do that when everything is so poor? And so how he was looking at it is we need quality, and then we can get to justice. But within justice, there is quality.
Okay, so last response, Morgan.
I could add just a little bit to that, Jos, as well. What I found is, in my situation, quality seemed to equal compliance, and compliance is not justice. So I can say it's not. So at the moment, in the EIAs I looked at, quality does not equal justice, if you look at it logically then.
Okay, so I don't think we actually finished answering all the questions, but we've run out of time, so apologies to the two speakers whose questions weren't answered, but of course you can talk to the speakers afterwards. So I just wanted to very quickly sum up. I know a lot of people came in after the start, where Ben summed up the journey that we'd made. This is the third conference where we've tried to work out exactly what quality means, and we published a paper where we suggested lots of dimensions, and so we've had some great contributions. So we had Morgan with his 198 areas of quality, which I thought was great. And you told us what quality varied by, what we weren't very good at, which was alternatives, which then tied in with what Tetsuya said later on. I was really interested that quality was going down over time. And actually I know that because I'm tight and I give my students the same environmental statements for the last 10 years to review, that their views of best practice change over time, because best practice moves on. So if you review the same environmental statement year on year, it gets worse, even though the text doesn't change. So, you know, I kind of wonder what's happening there, and it's the opposite from what Tetsuya had either, because they had new guidelines coming in, and there they were seeing an improvement over time. So that was quite interesting. We had Karen, who really tried to nail what justice was and gave us 3 parts to it, and me and Ben had a quick little chat about that, because one of those was access to justice, and then you gave us the 5 examples of judicial review, all of which were unsuccessful, which we thought was quite interesting, because then the extent to which, even though people have had access to the courts, they actually feel they've had access to justice, I wonder is perhaps a different question. And we had Bruce, and if there's one presentation that made me think that the conceptualization that we published is probably way off the mark, it was the one from Bruce. So, I mean, thank you for that, Bruce. We'll review it. That was the whole point. We were trying to learn from these different presentations. Marla, I think, also tried to nail down what justice was, and drew on the fact that transparency is critical for justice, which is where her research was leading, so that was all fascinating stuff. And Tetsuya, then we got the fact that the quality of environmental statements was improving through the guidelines coming in, so there was an improvement over time. If there was one question that I probably need to ask later, it's whether there actually is a relationship between alternatives and public participation, or it's just the fact that the better environmental statements, which have better public participation anyway, also have better alternatives, because the practitioners have just been better at their job. I'm not sure whether the relationship demonstrates causality, but again, that's interesting when we're trying to do these things, trying to work out exactly what it all means. So for me, I think this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for all coming and making it a really valuable event, and thank you in particular for the speakers. And they kept to time, even if myself and Ben didn't, and we've got you a little bit late for coffee. So thank you very much.